Many thanks for everyone that is in this webinar that is a collaboration between University of the Azores and the Luz American Foundation, in which the idea is to promote the connection and collaboration between researchers in Portugal and the United States. And we today will have three talks, starting with Professor Donald Drake from University of Hawaii at Manoa, then followed by shorter talks by myself and Professor Rui Bento Elias. And the topic today is discussing recent research in islands about biodiversity erosion and how we can promote some halting processes to avoid species extinctions in islands and to deal with the several factors that are promoting this biodiversity erosion, the different drivers that are promoting this degradation of quality of our habitats and the decreasing of species populations, etc. I will give first, in this case, to the word to Professor Donald Drake, that will introduce the thematic, and then we will talk with specific examples in the Azores. Thank you, Donald, for accepting this invitation and to share with all of us your recent research and recent review on this topic at island scale. I will stop sharing and you can share your screen.
All right, thank you. Yeah, interesting. We're talking about erosion of biodiversity. I just noticed my affiliation on the title slide was the botany department at University of Hawaii, and the botany department is now extinct. We have been absorbed into a school of life sciences, so that's some biodiversity erosion for you. Yeah, I'd like to thank Paulo for asking me to come and talk about this topic that my many colleagues and I have been doing in the last few years. And I'd like to thank you all for showing up, especially you folks in the Azores who are probably dying to have supper on Friday evening. So I hope you at least have something to drink while we go through this. Okay, let me see if I can change that. Okay. So I'm going to start very briefly by showing this slide. You know, species extinction is the ultimate form of biodiversity erosion, and everyone here knows that most extinctions in the past few thousand years have occurred on islands, so I'm really not going to go into that much more because it's a very familiar topic. But these extinctions lead to the loss of ecological interactions, and this threatens the species interaction networks that Pedro Jordano has referred to as the architecture of biodiversity. And so today I want to just briefly discuss a couple of the types of these interactions that we've been working on, mostly involving birds and mammals and flowering plants. But before we do that, let me just show you a brief sort of life cycle of plants and point out exactly what it is we're going to be looking at. Plants interact directly with animals as an important part of the reproductive cycle. In particular, we're going to be looking at the mutualistic interaction by which animals eat fruits and disperse seeds, and some of the antagonistic interactions where animals act as seed predators and destroy seeds, but there are also lots of animals that are somewhat intermediate. They disperse some seeds and they destroy other seeds. This is clearly a really critical part of the plant life cycle that can affect all sorts of aspects of population and community dynamics. We know that a lot of the species of animals on islands that disperse seeds have become rare or extinct. And we know that a lot of introduced species have appeared and in their place. And people have done some work to try and understand how those changes affect the plants. There's also been a fair amount of work looking at how introduced seed predators may affect plants, but there's been almost nothing done to look at what the effects are of the loss of the original native seed predators, which have in many cases disappeared. So today I'll talk a little bit about the changed frugivorous seed dispersal networks in the Hawaiian forests, and then look a little bit more broadly at some of the changes in the seed predator communities on several different islands around the world. But first, I'll just go ahead and kind of give you the big take-home message, because Evan Fricke produced a really nice paper last year that shows the scope of the global homogenization of the plant and animal communities that make up seed dispersal networks. So this top figure here on the left shows the extent to which different biogeographic regions share the same native species of fleshy fruited plants that have been documented in, quantified seed dispersal networks. And you can see that, most of these native species are local and they're shared only with other nearby regions. When you look at the shared species and include the introduced plants, suddenly all different parts of the world share a lot of similarity with each other. There's a lot of similar plants in Hawaii and the Azores. Down here in the second row, we have the shared animal species that are involved in seed dispersal networks. There's a little bit more biogeographic sharing with the native species, but still pretty discrete. When you look at the networks and you include the non-native animals that are shared, again, there's much more homogenization, much more similarity in the networks in different parts of the world. And then when you actually look at the pairs of interactions, which pairs of animals and plants are interacting with only native species, it's very localized. So every place has its own network with individual, with unique kinds of sets of species interacting. But today, because we've moved species around, things are much more similar in different parts of the world. If you look carefully, you'll see that there are pairs of species of plants and animals interacting in the Azores, and the same pairs of species are interacting with each other in New Zealand. So this is kind of the big take-home message, is that the globe is becoming homogenized, both in terms of shared species and in terms of species interactions. So, well, that's interesting. Having some interesting issues here with the pointer. Okay, so let's look specifically at what's happening with frugivorous seed dispersal networks in Hawaii. I'm part of a large group of people that's been working on this since 2014, and I'd especially like to single out Jeff Bugoni there, who was the lead author on two recent very nice papers on this topic. Oh, that's weird too. Something funny is going on with PowerPoint. Oh well. So most Hawaiian forest plants are adapted for dispersal by animals, and most of the relevant native animals are either rare or extinct. And there have been a lot of introduced animals that have now become involved in frugivorous and seed dispersal. So the questions then are, are these introduced animals substituting for the missing natives and dispersing native plants, or are the introduced animals mostly interacting with introduced plants? And are there some native species of plants that have simply lost dispersers and are no longer being dispersed, so they're out of the network? And the big question then is, depending on which way these changes are going, what are the consequences for Hawaiian forests? So to address this, we worked in 7 different forests across the island, dominated by either native or alien vegetation or a mix. And we captured birds, collected thousands of fecal samples, and identified over 100,000 seeds. And we then constructed networks. There's a lot of different ways to present these data, and I'll give you just the simplest one. We're going to look just at dispersal events, and a dispersal event is the total number of times that a species was present in a fecal sample, regardless of how many seeds of that species were present in the fecal sample. So if a bird pooped out a seed of one species, that was a dispersal event for that species, no matter how many seeds. So there's 4 different possible outcomes here in terms of interactions. You can have native birds dispersing native seeds, which is great. Native birds dispersing invasive alien plants, which is not so good. Alien birds dispersing native plants, which is good for the native plants. And the worst case is the alien birds dispersing invasive alien plants. And you probably won't be too surprised that the overwhelming majority of the dispersal events involved the alien birds dispersing invasive plants. There are a few cases where the alien birds are dispersing native plants, and unfortunately the native birds are just, the ones that are left on Oahu are just simply not very involved in frugivorian seed dispersal. So without going into detail on all the different networks, we'll just sort of lump everything together in one big network to show a little bit of the detail of what's going on. This is the combined network for all 7 forests over the course of the year. The birds are on the left, the plants are on the right, and I've put in a line on the left and right there to show in red or blue which species are alien and which species are native. One of the most interesting things about this network is that all of the interactions are novel. There are no connections between native birds and native plants. The dispersers are overwhelmingly alien birds, and the plants that they're dispersing are overwhelmingly alien plants. There are a few natives, but the top one doesn't come in until well down the network here. And this is Pipterus albidus. So it doesn't actually look too good for the native plants, but there's actually some sort of even worse news. It turns out that these introduced generalist birds are really only dispersing kind of small-seeded generalist fleshy fruited plants, whether they're native or alien. There aren't any introduced birds that are capable of dispersing seeds bigger than 7 millimeters in diameter. So there are a whole bunch of native species that have now lost their dispersers and may be dispersal limited, and that can be a problem, obviously, in maintaining their populations in the wild. So just to sort of summarize this, these seed dispersal networks are dominated by novel interactions with generalist alien songbirds dispersing mainly small-seeded alien plants that are occurring widely in time, meaning they fruit more or less throughout the year, and they're also widely distributed in space. Native plants are generally poorly dispersed, but the limited dispersal that is taking place is all from these alien birds, and it may be critical for them. This species of Delicia here is critically endangered, but the only thing that's dispersing it is 3 songbirds and a couple of game birds, which are actually also destroying some of the seeds. Large-seeded plants, especially the large-seeded native plants, may be lacking seed dispersers altogether. And so, you know, the potential future looks as if it's going to be a forest dominated by alien species with relatively small seeds. So there's a lot more to do to sort of understand what's going on and how it's going to affect the plants, not least of which because there are also seed predators in these communities. And This was a project which was largely speculative in nature, and it's something that's always kind of fascinated me. It was intended to draw attention to seed predation and its kind of poorly understood role as a natural process in plant communities on islands, in particular with respect to the native animals that would have been when seed predators. And this project involved a bunch of collaborators from different parts of the world. Seed predation is really important. It can limit plant recruitment, and it's been demonstrated to limit plant recruitment of some species on islands. And most of the studies that have done this have focused on introduced seed predators, such as rats. But there's been very little work done to understand what was going on in the natural plant communities that involved only native plants and animals. So it's a little bit of kind of interesting background. Janet Wilmshurst was looking for subfossil evidence to date the arrival of the Maori and Radixaculans in New Zealand, and she was able to compare the tooth marks on modern seeds with the tooth marks on subfossil seeds and then carbon date them to figure out when rodents and when people first arrived in New Zealand. But looking at even older subfossil deposits, she found that as many as 75% of those same seeds of the same species had been destroyed by parrots before people arrived. And then Joe Carpenter, then looking at coprolites from Moa, found that no seeds larger than 3 millimeters in diameter survived ingestion by the Moa. So clearly there was a lot of seed predation going on in New Zealand before rodents arrived. And so this led to the question of, just exactly how do the taxonomic and functional diversity of these modern introduced seed predators compare to the original native seed predators on the islands? And to assess this, we looked at a range of characteristics for 213 species of extinct native, extant native, and introduced vertebrate seed predators in woody plant communities in 3 different island groups. And we considered animals to be important seed predators if seeds were a significant part of their diet and they were at least as likely to destroy seeds as to disperse them. And this latter is a bit woolly. Determining exactly who is and who isn't a seed predator is more difficult than it sounds. It varies a lot in a sort of species by species way as you look at interactions between different plants and different animals. So let's look very quickly at some of the diversity of seed predators on these islands. This is New Zealand. Most of the seed predators originally were parrots, and they're some of them are still common. The IUCN status is listed after the name. They include these common ones and the very rare kakapo, whose reproduction is dependent on eating the seeds of the Dacrydium, and then the moa, who were browsers and just ingested fruits and seeds along with the vegetative parts of plants they ate, and their gizzards would crush the seeds. So this figure shows the number of different species of animals in different taxonomic orders in the past on the left and in the present on the right. Native common species are in dark green, native rare species in light green, and the alien species are in brown. You can see that in pre-human times, there were 4 orders of seed-eating animals. These included moa, the parrots, a couple species of ducks, and the New Zealand quail. Today, there are 7 orders, and they include a mix of native and non-native parrots, a lot of game birds, some songbirds, and 1 duck and 4 species of rodents, as well as a couple of other mammals. You can see that these big ratite birds that eat seeds are completely gone, and there are an entirely new group of organisms that has come into the equation, particularly the mammals. In Hawaii, there were also important large flightless herbivorous birds that probably ate and destroyed seeds as bycatch. These were our endemic lineages of large flightless geese and ducks, and they would have destroyed seeds in their gizzards. The other important birds were the heavy-billed finches in the honeycreeper radiation. This Kona grosbeak here in the bottom left was apparently a specialist on myoporum seeds. This poor individual actually was collected and turned into a skin right in the middle of eating a myoporum seed there, and it's still in its bill in the specimen drawer. The last remaining heavy-billed seed eater on the main Hawaiian Islands is the palila there on the right, and it's a specialist on the immature seeds of Sophora chrysophylla and some of the native insect larvae that live inside of them. So there were originally two orders of seed-eating birds, these big flightless waterfowl and a bunch of the finches. Nearly all of these are now gone, and today there are 6 different orders of seed eaters, including some new orders, and in particular the mammals are completely new. And the large flightless birds are gone. Finally, in the mascarenes, again, large flightless birds were important. These included the large iconic flightless pigeons like the dodo and the solitaire, but parrots were very important too. That's the broad-billed parrot and the sole remaining native seed eater, which was the echo parakeet from Mauritius. So there were 3 orders of seed eaters in the past. Now there are 6. Again, some of them have been lost and some new ones have been gained. In particular, the mammals are an entirely new group of seed eaters. So if you sum this up, there's some remarkably consistent patterns in the way the diversity has changed in these different islands. The species numbers of seed eaters have remained very stable. We've gone from 61 species across the islands to 60 species. But of those 61 original endemic species, only 9 are left. So all of the rest of the seed eaters now are made up of introduced species, and some of them occur across all 3 of these different island groups. Entire lineages have been lost, entire orders have been lost, and new orders have been gained. And it's just kind of really amazing how these seed predators have become homogenized across the globe, kind of in the same way that the frugivores and the plants that they disperse have been homogenized. And these changes are probably really ecologically significant because the omnivorous mammals having teeth are probably interacting with plants in very different ways than many of these extinct, basically extinct birds did. So the functional outcome of these interactions is maybe very different than it was. Replacing one frugivorous bird with another is maybe fairly equivalent, but replacing a parrot with a rat is maybe very different. So I think something quite different and quite interesting is maybe going on with the seed predators. So finally, just to kind of summarize this, this seed predation on these islands isn't new, but the original seed predators were birds, including large flightless generalist herbivores that destroyed seed as bycatch, plus more specialized pigeons and parrots and finches. And these have been almost completely replaced by generalist invasive species, including, again, these omnivorous mammals, which with their seeds probably pose very important and novel challenges to plants. But what's really, I think, most interesting is what we don't know. how can we determine the ecological roles of these long extinct species and compare them to what's out there today? We don't all have the same kind of subfossil data that they have in New Zealand to figure out who was doing what. What extinct species remain undiscovered or undescribed? Julian Hume reckons a quarter to a third of the extinct vertebrates on islands still haven't been discovered and described. Something which I know some of you will be interested in is, what about the invertebrates? Insects and land crabs must have been really important as seed predators, and they just don't leave the same kind of evidence behind as the vertebrates do, and there aren't enough people studying them either. Overall, how can we realistically compare the traits and impacts of these extinct natives, which we can't study, and the extant aliens? And how do plant defenses differ between the birds that they would have been eaten by in the past and the mammals that they're being eaten by now? And finally, and the most important question, I think, is, what's the importance of seed predation in the forests today, given all the other ecological changes that have occurred in these forests, including the loss of the seed dispersers, especially for the large-seeded species? Jansen-Connell theory would suggest that the combined impacts of loss of seed dispersers and addition of efficient seed predators would have a really severe impact. And so finally, I'd just like to leave you with this. This is a Myoporum tree on Mauna Kea. It's covered with both fresh and dried up, undispersed fruits. We know that this thrush species and the crow would both have eaten and dispersed it, but they're not in this habitat anymore. The palila here might disperse it. They do feed on it sometimes, but they're not doing it very much because they're critically endangered and down to hundreds of individuals. The seeds were the primary food of this Kona grosbeak, and it might even have accidentally dispersed sometimes, but the species is extinct, so it's not doing anything. So the trees just sit there. And the real philosophical question to me is, what is a forest without the full range of ecological interactions that should be taking place in it? And, is there any realistic way to restore these natural processes to our increasingly empty forests? And I'm sorry, after Paulo's introduction, I think maybe he was hoping for some answers or solutions, but I'm afraid I don't really have them. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge again all of my colleagues. These are just the co-authors of the papers. The entire crew of people who were involved in all of these studies is enormous. And I'd like to thank also, the funding organizations and others who facilitated our work. And again, thanks very much for being here on a Friday evening and letting me share this work with you.
Many thanks, Don, for this amazing data you shared with us. Of course, it's impressive. The patterns you showed are quite impressive, and probably we'll have a good discussion by the end of these talks. Now I will follow with my my presentation. Moment. Okay. Okay. I will talk specifically now about the Azores and some patterns now with insects and other arthropods. And starting by this figure where we try to summarize some of the main biodiversity erosion drivers in the Azores and possibly everywhere in other islands and other systems, in which, of course, invasive species are very important, but of course also climatic changes, habitat loss was very important in the beginning of human colonization, but even in the last 70 years there was still habitat loss and degradation and fragmentation, and of course very important also societal concern about biodiversity loss, or the lack of societal concern about biodiversity loss is also very important, because people do not have a adequate risk perception. What are the consequences about biodiversity erosion or biodiversity loss? Of course, all of these processes and drivers of biodiversity loss have impacts on taxonomic, functional, and phylogenetic diversity, and also probably are promoting evolutionary and adaptive changes as a consequence of the interactions between invasive species and native species, as Don talked before, homogenization of the systems. All of these already is currently and in the future may have a consequence on evolutionary processes that are still very difficult to understand. What are the patterns of arthropod invasion in the Azores? If we look for community structure of arthropods in Terceira Island and looking for native forests and soil epigean arthropods, we see that looking at only for this island, only 23 species of arthropods have 90% of overall numbers of individuals sampled in the last 20 years in this island. And what is of concern is that within these 23 species, almost 1/3 are already exotic species. That is, the 23 dominant species have already 1/3 of non-native species. If we look for the rarest species, high proportion are exotic species waiting probably for opportunities to increase their numbers, either as a consequence of ongoing habitat changes, interactions with the other species, and so forth. Therefore, one of the challenges we have here is to monitor during the next years how this pattern will change. That is, how species in the rare loads move to the common load, and if the common species group of species change with extinction of endemic and native in the common set. All these questions are unanswered, and this is why long-term monitoring will be needed in these islands to understand how this pattern. I show that is a picture of the last 10, 12 years of data. What will happen in future is something that we have to keep monitoring. If we look now for the soil arthropods in exotic forests and fruit trees, we see that the pattern is a dominance of exotic introduced arthropods, both in the common and in the rare group of species. That is, in human-dominated or human-made habitats, exotics, invertebrate exotics are already the winners in the system. Of course, there are some endemic species that still, in this case, 2 endemic species that still survive as dominant in these exotic forests, but they are an exception. If we look for canopy arthropods, situation is a little bit better. We see that endemic and native non-endemic still are the dominant species in the canopy of the forest, which is a good news, at least for this habitat. But look for the rare group of community that is already dominated by introduced species. That is, these introduced species are probably canopies a more difficult habitat in terms of adaptation to an exotic, for an exotic species, and they are in a process of adaptation and eventually competing already with the native and endemics. And of course, we are in an ecological time that is very short, and this is still a very short-term pattern, and possibly in long term, this optimistic pattern we see here, or positive pattern, will change for the worst at the long term. Because when we look for the exotic forests and orchards in canopy, we see already that exotic species are the dominant species. That is, in native forest canopy, native and endemic species still dominate in the abundant load, but in exotic habitat, forest habitat, in the canopy also dominate is introduced arthropods. This it is a strong pattern. I think I didn't publish this data I'm showing is not published. I think a good challenge is probably to, if we have data from other archipelagos, could be very interesting to compare. I think Rosemary Gillespie probably is getting this kind of data soon, and eventually we can see, compare what is going on in Hawaii and in the Azores with this kind of data. But at the same point, this is a trend, a pattern that we should look for in terms of monitoring these ecosystems. Then we move to, based on these trends, what in the Azores we move to a red listing of the current endemic species. We created a IUCN Mid-Atlantic Island Invertebrate Specialist Group, and we, after red listing about 250 endemic arthropods, we see that, for instance, for spiders, the 76% of species are threatened either in critical endangered, vulnerable categories within IUCN. For Lepidoptera, situation is not so bad because they can disperse better and have a wider distribution in the Azores. But look for beetles that disperse very poorly, and we have even species that we can consider as extinct. Therefore, we indeed, concerning beetles, we are in a very concerned situation with almost 93% of the endemic beetles evaluated being in a very bad status. With all the 235 arthropods evaluated in the last 5 years of work, we have in overall about half of the species are threatened, which is very bad news in general. Because of that, we call for, in a situation where we are in extinction depth in these oceanic islands, with many species already extinct, and the extinct species, as we showed before, are the large-bodied size beetles, are those that are extinct. And we, in assessing the landscape processes that are promoting this extinction, we conclude that connectivity is very important, and we should increase levels of corridors, native forest corridors between fragmented forests to increase connectivity in these very rare species. Promoting, when we modeled the impact of climate change and other factors in these some rare species, we see that the tendency is to a decrease in distribution, which is of high concern. In some cases, for instance, species can lose in the future more than 50% of their habitat due to fragmentation, climate change, and loss of connectivity. Then we applied to European Community, and we got recently Life Beetles project, almost €2 million project to restore habitat restoration in 3 islands. In this case, using 3 species of beetles as indicators: Tarfius fluorescensis in Flores Island, in which we want to perform restoration in this island and try to remove invasive plants and improve the habitats for these species and many other invertebrates in the island. Trechus terrabravensis in Terceira Island, that is reduced to high elevation hyperhumid forests, and we want to improve the quality of these areas, removing invasive plants and increasing the connectivity between forests. And Pseudocomens aptinoides, a species with is an endemic genus from Azores, that is a very rare ground beetle that lives only in central plateau of Pico, and in which we want to also perform habitat restoration in this island. As a consequence, we join a group of scientists that want to promote insect conservation and recovery in Europe, in the world, and the life projects are now being promoted in Europe to conserve invertebrates, and this is good news. And of course, what is needed is to design complex and integrated solutions to promote the long-term conservation of island invertebrates. One of the challenges is the global monitoring program, and we already designed protocols for that in collaboration with many scientists working in islands. And the idea is to try to promote, get all this information to improve habitat management and perform arthropod conservation. Thank you. Thank you for your for your attention. Now I will give the floor very rapidly to Rui Elias to give. I will stop
sharing, please. Okay, just putting the chronometer here. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about what we sorry, this is not working very well here. A little bit about what we are doing in the Azores in order to predict or try to predict the impact of climate change on island biodiversity, on our island's biodiversity. You know that, of course, everyone knows that climate change is one of the biggest threats to biodiversity. And for the Azores, this data is based on the Cielo model. And I guess many of you should know, or know or not. But this Cielo model is from our colleague Eduardo Brito, de Azevedo, and this, of course, it was used for the regional strategy for combat or for the mitigation of climate change for the Azorean government. And what is expected by the end of the century, of course, we have two scenarios, at least 4.5 RCP and the RCP 8.5. So these scenarios are very similar until 2039, but after that they diverge. The worst case scenario, of course, admits for the end of the century 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Celsius of increasing temperature in the Azores. Worse than that is that if you can see in this map, you can see that these are the monthly values. These are the annual values. You can see that the increase in the center of the islands is higher, and this is could be a very big problem, just because of the fact that most of the natural vegetation that still remains is on the center of the islands, and all the remaining native forests are on the center of the island. So the impact could be even bigger in the areas where we have the remaining native forests. One interesting thing also is that for the western group, the increase in temperatures are not as high as in the other groups. So this is what we have in terms of expectations for the final of the end of the century. But actually, this is already going on. So we have here the temperature anomalies for January and for July, and this is in relation to a period of 61 to 90 in the 20th century. And you can see that Flores, this is Flores, Angra is in Terceira Island, Ponta Delgada is in São Miguel. You can see that in those three islands, in the last 20 years, most of the years, if not almost all of the years, the temperature was higher than the reference period. Sometimes almost as higher as 3 degrees. So this is actually happening. So what are we doing to predict or anticipate the consequences of this? Of course, we started by and still are doing this bioclimatic modeling. We are also now starting with the in situ experiments, and almost 10 years ago we implemented, Paulo already talked about that a little bit, network of permanent plots that will enable us to follow what is going on our native forest, on our native vegetation, and among the major groups of arthropods, at least arthropods, bryophytes, and vascular plants. So in 2012, we had this project. We started this project, Impact Bio, which ended in 2015. And this was the first project that did bioclimatic modeling in the Azores, and for the 3 large groups of bryophytes, arthropods, and vascular plants. From here, we published. This is not. Why is not working? Sorry, it's not the. Okay. So from this, we published the first paper in 2016. Actually, it was one of the two first papers published for Macaronesia on the effects of climate change. Was this one and another led by Jairo Patinho. And what we found, or at least what our models said or expected, is that we can lose, among the 206 species studied or modeled, 90% of them were projected to lose climate space. And this was even worse among vascular plants, and bryophytes were the best case scenario. More than that, we also found that for vascular plants and arthropods, a tendency for an upward shift in altitude. Okay, so moving towards the center of the islands. This is the other paper I spoke about by Jairo Patinho, also with Rosalina and Paulo. They studied the potential distribution the potential distribution of 35 Macaronesian endemic bryophytes, under present future climate conditions, a little bit like we did with in our work. And they expect an average decrease of suitable areas between 62 and 87% per species, and even a possible extinction of 6 species. With Impact Bio, we also studied the effectiveness of the current natural areas. Of course, Impact Bio was then also only in São Miguel and Terceira, so not all the islands. There was no possibility of that. But for São Miguel and Terceira, what our studies showed is that in our case here in Terceira, the current design of protected areas should be enough to protect biodiversity in the future. But in São Miguel, there is a possibility that these areas could have to be redesigned because of a possible shift of important biodiversity areas. This is a paper that Paul already spoke about, so I will not repeat what he said, of course. We also had some work with our colleagues in the CBU. This one mainly working on different types of models, and also with another island, Pico. And recently in 2019, we started a project in pastures because unfortunately, the European Union in the last 7 years only funded projects in dealing with agriculture, sea or tourism. So we had to adapt. Our original idea was to do this on native vegetation. So we adapted to pastures to start and understand how things could work. And we have 3 different pastures, 3 different altitudes. In each of these patches, we have 10 plots where we are rising the temperature by putting open top chambers, like these ones here. And of course, we have also 10 control plots. What we are trying to do or to answer is try to see what is the effect of the temperatures on the productivity of the grasses, on soil nutrient availability. Also on the neutral value of the grasses. Of course, this is from the perspective of the cattle, of course, and very importantly also what it could be expected on the influence of climate change on the arthropods of the pastures. And of course, finally, we have our network of permanent plots. 10 of them are in common with Tenerife and Canary Islands and La Réunion. These are 10 50 by 50 meter plots on native forests. We have the baseline data is the TBH of all trees with more than 10 centimeters and a list of vegetable plant species. So this is the baseline data that we can compare now. We will try in 2022. We have to get funding for this. With the second sampling. So the plan is to every 10 years do a resampling of these plots. The same happens with these other plots. They started with this project MoveClim that was led by our colleague Rosalina. The previous one was led by Paulo, and now what we have is a quite big network of 88 plots in 7 islands. These are smaller plots. They are situated from sea level to the maximum altitude at each 200-meter level. And for these ones, the baseline information is the abundance of bryophytes and vascular plant species. And we are planning to start the second sampling in 2023. So this is what we are doing here in the Azores. And thank you for listening. Okay.